Okay, hello everybody, and we are about ready to start working on our fourth project here, which is dealing with timers on the screen and text, updating text on the screen. So if you didn't do the last tutorial, you should probably do that one. I'm going to start a new 2D project. I just called it Project 4, and I'm going to create it. There it goes. And I'm just going to let that fire up here. And as it loads, I'll talk about what we're going to do today. So we're going to put more text on the screen just like we did in the previous one. And then from source code, oh boy. Okay, see what happens. From source code, we will be able to update that text, and then we'll be able to update it based on a timer, because timers are very useful in different things. If you want to have the amount of time that somebody is in a level or an amount of time that somebody has to do something, we can use timers to do that. And so we're going to go over how to use timers, and you can use them to update time on the screen, or you could use them for a variety of things. It's up to you. But hopefully this loads up here pretty quickly. And then we'll do that. So we're going to do a couple things. We're going to need to include more libraries in our source code so that we can access the text objects on the screen. And we are going to use different types of functions so that we can do that. And they are called IEnumerators. That's the return type. And that's going to allow us to run stuff in the background. And running stuff in the background is important for timers because we don't want to hold off what's happening on our scene just to run a timer. So that's sort of the intro, the ad lib intro as we wait for this thing to load up. But now that things are rolling, let's get ready to go. Let's make some timers and show you how to update the text on the screen from source code. Okay, so here is our wonderful thing. Remember, we did a 2D environment. All this stuff does work in 3D, but it's a lot better if you want to follow along to make sure that you are using 2D as well. If your screen doesn't look like this, close your project and open a new one. So I'm going to go through quickly because we've already talked about some of this stuff before. Changing my background color because I hate the ugly blue. We are going to create some UI elements, some text on the screen like we did before. So remember with our canvas, we changed our screen space to camera. Our render camera is set to main camera. And then our text on here, I'm just going to say time. Oops. Time, colon, 0. And then if we look at our game, wonderful game screen, we have a thing here that says time 0. And the only thing that I really want to do is make this time count the number of seconds. So every second that elapses, this thing is going to go up by 1. So just count forever. And that's it. That's what we want to do. So, but right now, I mean, that's kind of hard. If I hit the go button here, of course, nothing is going to happen. It's just going to sit there and stare at us because we haven't put any source code together. So all in all, in this little example, we may write, it'll be less than 10 lines of code. So it's going to be very small. Again, it's not hard if you know what to type in. So that's kind of the trick with all of this stuff is it's all very, very simple. It's all very short. But if you don't know how to type anything in, then it's going to be a little bit challenging. So watch this video, you'll get it, and it won't be so bad. So I am going to create a new source code. So I'll right-click down here. Ignore that. Right-click in the Assets window down here. Go to Create, C# script, and I'm going to call it Counter. And with that, I will just double-click on it. And Visual Studio will open up. And a couple things to make sure once this comes up here is to make sure that your class name matches your file name. So if you rename the file inside of the Unity editor, that's fine. You've got to rename your class as well. And remember, don't use spaces in your class names or your source code file names. So right here is my class name, Counter. And then that matches this file name right here, Counter. So we're in good shape. If yours doesn't match, change this one to match. Okay, so a couple things. What are we doing here? I'm just going to put right at the very top of all of this stuff, what are we trying to do? Uh, we want to make a 1-second timer, and every tick of that timer, we want to update a counter, and then when we update the counter, we want to update it on screen. So that is what we want to do. We're going to have a counter that is just a variable. That's kind of like a hidden thing that nobody sees. That'll keep track of how many seconds we've been running. And then we're going to have that variable be displayed on screen here and update this part. So that's the three kind of steps that we're going to go through. Is we're going to first get something that ticks every second, then we're going to keep track of the number of seconds, and then we're going to update on the screen. That's it. Very, very simple. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is there's a whole bunch of ways. I guess I'll start out with that. The reason I'm doing it this way is because I think it's a lot more versatile, that you can take the ideas and concepts that I explain over the next minute or two and apply them in a whole bunch of different ways. So if you're out there and the only thing you care about is 1-second timers or counting seconds, I'm sure there's more direct ways to do that. That's not specifically what we're trying to do here. I'm trying to show a whole bunch of things through one example. Okay, so essentially what we're going to have is I'm going to make a function, void, call it 1-second timer. And here it is. And so essentially what we want to have, and this is wrong, by the way. Let me zoom in on this. I'm going to come back here and change some of this in a second. We're not going to leave it alone. But I just want to walk through what we're doing for our 1-second timer. And again, this is this part of our little statement at the top. So if we had something like this, which we'll call an infinite loop, while 1 equals 1. And the double equals, I don't think we've talked about it in here. That's a comparison. So if you say A equals B, you're going to change the value of A. When you have this double equals, it's a comparison. So what this says is while 1 is equal to 1, which is always going to be true, we're going to be inside this loop. And it's what they call an infinite loop because you'll never get out of it. And in general, it's a bad thing to do. But the way we're going to structure this, it's okay. So don't panic. So while we're in this loop, and the reason it's going on forever is because we're going to start at 0 and we're going to count all the way up as long as the program's running. And we never want it to stop. So that's why it's going to be okay to do this infinite loop if we structure it properly. So while 1 equals 1, we want to wait for a second and then increment some counter. And we want to do that over and over and over again, right? We want to wait for a second, then increment some counter. Then we'll wait for a second, increment a counter. So what this while loop means is we're going to go in sequence this line, then this line. When we hit this end curly brace, we jump right back to the top and then do this line and this line. And since 1 is always going to be equal to 1, we're going to be doing this forever. We're going to wait a second, increment some counter. Wait a second, increment some counter. Make sense? Good. Okay, so 2 things we got to do. We've got to figure out the code to do this and the code to do this. So let's do this one. I'm just going to type it in. Yield, return, new, wait for seconds, wait for seconds, and we're going to say 1F. Wait for a second. That's exactly what this does. And remember, we're casting stuff with a float. That we know that it can be 1.0, 1.1, 2.8, whatever it is. So we'll put a little f there. That's how we wait for a second. These yield returns are super powerful, but we're not going to get into what they actually do, not in this one anyways. So just know that this is how you're going to kind of pause this while loop. You're not pausing your whole program. You're not pausing the entire game. You're just pausing this while loop for 1 second. And when you do it with this yield return, that allows other things to happen on the screen. So it'll just pause for a second, and it still allow you to do your inputs, mouse clicks, arrow keys, all of that sort of stuff. You're not locking up the whole program. You're just pausing this while loop. That's all. Notice when I put this in here, we got a red squiggle on our function name. And that's okay. We'll take care of that one in a second. But this is how we wait for a second. I'm saying second a lot. Okay, now we want to increment some counter. So let's make a counter up at the top. I'm just going to say int seconds equals 0. Okay, an integer is counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so we don't need to put the little f at the end. That would be a float or double, where we would say 0f, like we did down here. So since we're only going to count number of seconds and not half seconds, we can get away with using an integer. Okay, int seconds equals 0. This is going to be our counter. So then we can come down here and we can say seconds equals seconds plus 1. And this is just how we did moving in the x direction in one of the older videos. Seconds equals seconds plus 1. Good. So that was easy. And hopefully that's right. But now we've got this problem of this red squiggle and why is it having an issue. So the reason why is that we have this yield return here that says we're going to pause this function for a little bit. And in order to do that, we have to define this function as a specific type so that the system knows that at some point this function could be paused. And right now we have not done that. So the way we do that, instead of void, we say enumerator. Whoops. Not there. Mouse move my cursor. We're going to put it there. Enumerator 1 second timer. So this is the type. And as an enumerator, that means that we're going to be able to do this pause business down here. And then this is the name of our function, 1 second timer. So this is looking pretty good. This is how we make a 1 second timer. I want to show one other thing while I'm in here. How do we know? Well, if we look at our thing here, we have our goals. We have a 1 second timer. Every tick of that timer, we want to update a counter. Okay, so we did this. Every tick of the timer, we update our counter. There you go. And then when we update the counter, we want to update on the screen. So updating the text on the screen is going to take a few more lines of stuff. Before we do that, I just want to show a little bit of a quick way to test and see if things are working. Because sometimes if you set out and you write too many lines of code, you're going to have so many opportunities to make mistakes that it's better to test as you go. So I want to make sure that these first two things are working right before we launch off into this one. And the way we're going to do that is with this thing called debug log. So if I say debug.log seconds, this one little statement here is going to be very useful. It's going to print in our Unity environment what the value of seconds is. So remember, what we want this to be is to start at 0, and then we wait for a second, and then it's going to go increment by 1 to a 1, and then we print it out, and then we're going to wait for a second, and then it'll increment to 2, we print it out, then it'll wait for a second, increment to 3, we print it out, wait for a second, increment to 4, we print it out, and you get the idea. And that's, if all this stuff is working right, that's what we'll see. So I'm going to save this. Control S. Go back to Unity, and I'm going to hit the Go button, and it should print out stuff here in this console tab. So here's project, here's console. So if I hit play, it's not going to work. But let's see, we don't see anything. Nothing's happening. And if our 1 second timer was working and we did everything right, we should be seeing a log over here. And we're not. And so there's a couple reasons why. So let's think about why. When we made a source code in the past to move images around using the arrow keys, remember we didn't just write our source code, we had to attach it to something in our scene, to an object. And I am going to attach this to our canvas. So I've highlighted canvas up here in the hierarchy, and then I'm going to click on counter and drag it over here into this empty gray space. So I'm just going to click and drag it down here. So now the script is attached to this. So the first reason it wasn't running is because the script wasn't attached to anything. It was just an asset. It was something that we could use if we wanted to, but we hadn't attached it to anything. So now that we've got it attached to the canvas, now we hit play and it should go. And if we click on our console to see the output, it's still blank. So yeah, it's broken, and I knew it would be broken, but let's figure out why. And one of the reasons why I'm showing you this way is because if we had tried to code up all of the stuff about actually updating on the screen and we thought that was going to work, we would have written a lot more code and it would be much harder to troubleshoot. So right now, since we're just trying to check if this seconds value is actually getting incremented every second, then we don't have to worry about checking the extra piece of how do we update the thing on the screen. We'll get to that later. Okay, so we know this isn't working. Why? So by default, let's go back and look at what we get. We get a start function that gets called when the program starts up. And then we get an update, which is called every frame update, 60 times a second. We wrote our 1 second timer here. So the only way when we start our program, we either Unity lets us write code in this one, or we can write code in this update. We haven't done anything to utilize this code here, because stuff just doesn't happen by itself. So what we got to do is inside of start, we've got to say, okay, this gets called when our program starts. So inside of here, we want to do one additional thing, which is to start our 1 second timer. So we'll say start coroutine 1 second timer, like that. And by doing this kind of business here, what we're saying is this, by saying start coroutine, we're saying this function is essentially going to run in the background. And that's what we want it to do. We want it to run in the background and just tick up seconds. So when our program starts, we're going to start this function to run in the background. And here we go. So let's see if that works. So Control S and hit the go button. And if we look at our console, every second we see this thing getting updated, which is awesome. It's not getting updated here, but it's getting updated down here. So we know that we did this. We made it a 1 second timer. Every tick we update the counter. And then now we're on this last step. When we update the counter, we want to update on the screen. So I want this thing to say time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, time 5. So how do we do that? Well, it's not that bad. What we need to do is get a reference. We need to know, we could have a whole bunch of different text objects on the screen, and we need to know which one to update. So what we do is we get a link or a reference to this object here so we know which one to update. And in order to do that, we have to do another using statement at the top here, using Unity engine.ui. And that's going to allow us to utilize any of these UI elements that we'll find here, like buttons and text and those sorts of things. So using Unity engine.ui. Next thing we got to do is we need to get a variable. Seconds is a variable that holds the number of seconds. We need a variable that's going to hold a reference to this actual text object on the screen, this one right here. So I can say public text, and we'll say second display. How's that? So anywhere in our code now, when we reference seconds display, it's going to be linked up to this. That's what we want. We need to link them. And so if I click on my canvas now, and I Control S out of this to save it. If you don't save it, you won't see it. So make sure you save inside of Visual Studio. Go back. In our canvas now, we have down here in the lower right, seconds display is set to none. And just like we did in the other example, when you make variable public, it shows up down here as something you can populate within the user interface. So we're going to take, it's asking us which text is our seconds display, and it's this one here right below canvas in the hierarchy. So I'm going to click, let me fix this, I'm going to click and drag this text over to here. So click and drag text, there. Now they're linked up. So anywhere in our code that we use seconds display, that is going to refer to this thing here. So I can say here seconds display dot text equals, we're going to say time colon, and then I can say plus seconds, like that. Because I want my display to be time and then the number of seconds. And so we can add these two things together. So it'll say time and then we'll say plus, and it will be the seconds, the value of seconds. And then if I save that and hit go, hopefully this will work. There we go. And so now we're updating on the screen. We also still have our debug happening down here, which is good for our information, but the cool thing is what's happening on the screen is what we wanted. And so that's what we got. We got our timer. We did our three things. We made a 1-second timer, which was this whole while loop. Every tick we update a counter. So we created this variable integer seconds. This is how we updated it. And when we update the counter, we want to update on screen. So in order to update on screen, we had to include that, unityengine.ui. We had to link up some text reference on our GUI, and then the actual update was this line right here. And we also learned about debug log to print stuff to the console. So that's it. That's my text and timers. Think about all the different ways you could use timers to do different things. And it's pretty powerful. This whole business here is a pretty powerful little thing. And you can do it for a lot more than just updating a little number on the screen. You can use it for all kinds of internal counters and whatever it is that you need to do. So that's it. That's text and timers. And we'll see you on the next one.